Well, good morning, church, and welcome to Crossroads. If I haven't met you, I'm Kenny, one of the pastors on our team, and whether you're here in Odessa or on one of our other locations, I'm grateful that you're here today. And if you don't know, Crossroads has 5 locations across the Permian Basin, and I want to start today. We started this series last weekend called James, and we're going to look at James chapter 2 and a couple of really interesting things that James tells us to do with our life as followers of him, as followers of Christ. But before we get there, I want to tell you a couple of quick things that are really cool about some of our other locations. And so if you didn't know, we have a location in Hobbs, a church in Hobbs inside the Lee County Correctional Facility. We launched it in May, and it's from the first time I went to the last time we had the opportunity to meet in Hobbs, the attendance there has doubled. And what's really cool, we've seen over 20 people within our church trained and cleared and stepped foot on our Hobbs campus to worship alongside the inmates there. And there's some great men and some authentic worship. And so God's really doing some cool things at our Hobbs campus. And so I'm grateful for that. And I want to I think it's worth celebrating. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really cool. Really cool. And also, if you didn't know, we started a location in West Odessa back in January of this year. And so I want to tell you today about their new home, our West Odessa campus. And so back in December, if you were part of our church in that season, you know we typically kind of do a year-end offering. A lot of times the giving goes to other organizations or it goes to partners. Last year we partnered with a few nonprofits that we believed in that were kind of that a fusion of capital would really help with them. And so we also asked the church in great faith, we said, hey, we don't really know why, but we believe God is asking us to set aside some resources from this offering for a future thing in 2019. Anybody remember this? We said, hey, would you give to a future campus development or something like that? We weren't sure what it was, but we asked our church to come alongside us in faith, and you did, and we met that goal. And I'm here to tell you, it was your generosity then that makes this conversation today possible. Our West Campus has been meeting at Buddy West Elementary School, and it's gone pretty well there, but we've had the opportunity to partner with the Boys and Girls Club and to help them fund their operation at the brand new location they haven't even opened yet, adjacent to Downing Elementary School. And so our church will meet there on Sunday mornings, and we'll get to partner with the club. Our staff will office in the facility there, and it's a full-on partnership that we are super excited about and was made possible financially because of generous giving of many of you across all of our locations. So thank you for being generous, and just out of the blue, an opportunity comes up like this. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really exciting. So our West Campus is joining us now live on Sunday mornings. In a couple of weeks, they'll move into that facility when it opens up. You may be asking, well, why the move? Why did we leave Buddy West? Well, just briefly, ECISD kind of priced us out. They had some changes, priced us out of meeting at Buddy West Elementary. They graciously gave us a window of time to find a new home, and so God provided for that opportunity. We're for ECISD. We had hundreds of coaches, administrators, teachers on our campus here at the Odessa campus just a few weeks ago. We're going to maintain our relationship with Buddy West. We're continuing to doing after-school Bible clubs there. We call it 252, and so West team, we're excited. Campus, we're excited. We can't wait to see how God blows up the work that he's doing in this new location. It's going to be really exciting. So today, James chapter 2, all that to say, James chapter 2. We're going to talk about, there's 2 giant principles in that chapter I want you to hear about today. The first is about faith and works, and the second is about favoritism and discrimination. And so this is a whole giant spectrum of things that's probably going to be uncomfortable, but listen. That's all I know how to do, make people uncomfortable. And usually it's because I'm being awkward. So it's going to be great. It's going to be a lot of fun. So James is a book on genuine faith. That's the whole concept behind the book. Our student pastor, Philip, last weekend knocked it out of the park, talking about James chapter 1 and gave us a great picture. So if you missed it, you can go online and check that out. But James was written by a guy named James. That's not always true in the New Testament. You get to a book and you say, well, was this book written by like Titus? Was this written by Titus? Well, no, it wasn't actually written. But that's true in James. James was written by James. And what's interesting about James is that James was not a believer in Jesus until after the resurrection. But he was immediately a leader in the church, the local church there in Jerusalem. The Apostle Paul, who you may have heard of, he was discipled and mentored by this guy James. And so he went through a really fast transformation of diving all in. And what would create that kind of environment for James? Well, James was Jesus' half-brother. Same mama, different daddy, as you might imagine, okay? And so this James was Jesus' half brother. James grew up in the same house as Jesus. Imagine that, going to school together, riding the camel one way, both, to school, right? Imagine, there's not enough bread. Everybody, who took the last piece of bread? And Jesus just makes more appear at dinner table, right? Imagine, hey, we can't get across the lake. The ferry's full. Don't worry about it, guys. Hop on, we'll all walk across the water, right? I mean, imagine growing up in that household. I don't know that any of those things actually happen, all right? If you leave, well, Kenny said, no, that's not true, all right? But what did happen is that he grew up in a household where Jesus grew up. Like when everyone else stubbed their toe, things came out of their mouth that I'm not allowed to say with a microphone on, right? But when Jesus stubbed his toe, it was like blessings from the Lord, right? I mean, imagine that, right? How mad would you be at your brother? Like, I can't figure out how to be a carpenter. Jesus picks it up like that. That's the household that James grew up in. And James grew up in this household not believing that Jesus was anything other than his brother. So Jesus becomes, he comes out and says, hey, I'm the Lord. He gets baptized. He starts performing miracles. And James sits in the back and says, I don't think so. I grew up with that kid. I know he ain't the Lord. Imagine, how many of you have a brother? How many of you have a brother that could convince you that he was the Lord? I talked to my brother this morning. I love my brother. He ain't the Lord. Like, he's tried it. Hey, what about James? No, I know you're not the Lord. All right, don't even try. It doesn't work. And that's where James is writing from a position that's so fascinating. He came to faith later in life, but immediately knew everything there was to know because he grew up literally with Jesus. Fascinating. So he starts out his book in James chapter 1, verse 1. He says, to the 12 tribes of the dispersion, is the word he uses is dispersion. And you may connect that in your mind if you're familiar with vocabulary to diaspora. That's another word, or just disperse. So a couple of years ago, I'm in Moldova, and Moldova is a little country in Eastern Europe. It's very poor, it used to be communist. They're still trying to figure all their stuff out. And one of the things the missionary tells me while we're there, he says, the best place to find somebody from Moldova is outside of Moldova. I say, well, why is that? He said, there's no opportunity here. So young people leave Moldova, they go find jobs in other countries, and they mail money back. And really in the first century, it's a great picture of why James is writing. Because the best place to find a Jew in the first century is not in Jerusalem. It's not in Israel. The best place to find a Jew is dispersed throughout the empire. So James isn't writing to a group of Jews. He's writing to Christians who happen to also be Jews. It shows us the condition, this diaspora, them being dispersed. Many of them, they're all immigrants to other parts of the Roman Empire. They live in conditions of poverty and oppression. It caused them to live away because they had to live away from their home country. And so James is writing to tell them, how do I respond? How do I have a proper perspective when life is hard? How do you act like a Christian in the face of hardship? He's writing to say, don't be flipping on Facebook. Don't try to start some religious crusade, and don't flip people off on the highway or in the hallway. Live like Jesus. So I want you to write a couple of things down if you're a note taker this morning. This is the first. We don't play favorites with God's people. We don't play favorites with God's people. James chapter 2, verse 1. Here's what it says. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? Can you imagine calling your brother the glorious Lord? My brother's name is Chris. Your glorious Lord, Chris. No, that doesn't work. But somehow James got there in his mind. It's mind-numbing to me and gives a lot of credibility to the case for Jesus as Lord of my own life. He says, our glorious Lord, Jesus Christ, if you favor some people over others. How do you do that? He says. For example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes, expensive jewelry, another comes in who is poor, dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention to the good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there or else sit on the floor, well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? Whew, we've already hit an awkward word. Here we go, right? I mean, in our culture, in our world today, we're talking about this. Here's what James is talking about. He's writing to a group of churches that are showing favoritism to rich people because primarily the churches don't have very deep pockets. There's not a lot of people of means that are attending the churches. And James's example is using clothing. But in our communities, most of the time, it's not clothing, it's debt. And for some people, it certainly is clothing, but tattered jeans and a dirty shirt or a pressed Armani suit, he says, we're going to treat people the same way because they're equal in God's economy. No one with means is going to take it with them. If you don't believe me, ask a Pharaoh from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, right? All of their stuff was buried with them, and then tomb raiders came a couple hundred years later and just took it all, right? I mean, they don't have their stuff. And so we live in a time of great division. Lines have been drawn regarding race and gender. And those with less are looked down by those with more, or those with more are looked down by with those with less. We have a tendency to take a difference, create a competitive advantage around it in our minds, just create an advantage that we must be better than they are because we're different than they are, and we just destroy the unity that Jesus came to die for. This idea doesn't work. It doesn't add up. It just doesn't work. And that's what James is writing about. He's saying, if you're going to follow Christ, that junk don't fly. I mean, that's not his language. That's certainly mine. And so the gospel, it actually Christianity spreads across the early Roman Empire to Gentile converts and Jews who were primarily poor and unkept. And so when they walked into a church that was living out the principles of Jesus, they felt welcomed at Crossroads. We don't care what you're wearing, as long as you're wearing something. You show up butt naked. I don't know if I'm allowed to use those words, but I did, all right? You show up butt naked, and we have people that are going to be like, hey, can we give you some clothes? Because you can't go in that way, right? That's going to be a distraction, right? I mean, we don't care what you're wearing. We don't care what your bank account looks like, 6 zeros or red ones. It doesn't matter because one of our core values as a church is that everyone matters. Not someone matters, not these people in this group matter, but everyone matters. We believe it and we live it. And so if this is your church, I hope that you choose to live out that core value, to live out that principle in who you are as a follower of Christ, because everyone matters. And we're going to find out why it's so important for everyone to matter. James is going to make it crystal clear. And you might be saying, I don't do that, right? I don't live that way. How often are our heads down when we see someone that we don't want to interact with? How often do we cross the street or cross the hallway so we can avoid a conversation? How often do we fake a phone call or dip into an aisle, right? When I was a kid, I grew up outside of the city of Baltimore. And Baltimore is kind of a difficult city. There's lots of difficult cities. It happens to be one of them. And so when I was a kid, we would grow up going to sporting events. We'd go into the town to see the Orioles play, and that was about all. And it was pretty pathetic, but we'd go anyway. And so every time we'd go, my dad liked to take the train. We'd come out of the train area, the subway system, and there was people everywhere. And lots of people were sitting on the sides of the buildings asking for money. And one of the distinguishing things I remember about my childhood is my dad giving out money to people along the way. And maybe he didn't give it out every time, but in my mind, I remember him living generously. And it wasn't until several years later that I had somebody giving me some advice. And I have a tendency to be a bit skeptical. And it wasn't until years later somebody gave me an advice and said, you have a choice. You can either choose to think always negatively and skeptical about those people that are different than you, or you can choose to live generously in that environment. Now, there is certainly wisdom to be had, but the responsibility of me is to be obedient to Christ, to engage with somebody different than me, to engage with somebody who might need help, to engage with somebody that God may lead me towards. And so I can either teach my own kids to live generously, or I can teach them to be skeptical. There's really not an in-between. I'll tell you as a millennial, the hard thing is these people don't take Venmo, and I don't know how to pay them. Like, I don't carry cash. Who carries? So for me, I've had to frankly be intentional. If I'm going to be generous, I have to be intentional. And if I'm going to value difference, I have to be intentional. Because what we find is that there are many people who are poor who are spiritually poor, but there's many people who are rich who are spiritually rich. Our socioeconomic status, our ethnic status, right? Our race, our gender, none of those things determine the value we have in front of God. Money can keep us from seeing who God is. Poverty can keep us from seeing who God is. There's a group of Taliban fighters who ended up in America in early 2001 to perform the greatest terrorist act of our time. And you know what drove that? Poverty, because they hoped there was something better in their life than what they were currently living in Afghanistan. Poverty blinded them from hope and love, and so can money. It can blind you from hope and money. Either side of the spectrum. What we find, all these things aside, is that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Church, it doesn't matter. There is no version of following Jesus where different people are valued different ways. There is not a version. In fact, it's a direct contradiction. And that's why I believe, and I believe James is going to flat out tell us in a minute, because you're going to read it for yourself, discrimination in any form is a contradiction to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Read this, James chapter 2, verse 9. If you favor some people over others, you're committing a sin. Well, that's pretty clear, right? Let's wrap it up, head on home. It's pretty obvious. He says, you're guilty of breaking the law. He's writing to a group of Jews. These Jews valued holding up the law. They valued rules. They lived for generations under rules. He says, for the person who keeps all of the laws except one is as guilty as the one who has broken all of God's laws. You can't pick and choose, is what he's saying. You just can't do it. You can't pick and choose. In fact, he says it this way in verse 10. He says, you can't pick and choose these things, specializing in keeping one or two things in God's law and ignoring others. The same God who says, don't commit adultery, also said, don't murder. It doesn't do any good to go before God and say, hey, God, I didn't kill anybody. Hey, God, I didn't have any affairs. Hey, God, I didn't do this one thing, but I did 300 other really bad things. You can't claim I'm really good at not sinning in one area, because if you've done one, you've done them all. It's every sin is a gateway drug to all the sins in the world. And that's what James is trying to communicate. We can't live out our works. We can't live out in works to get to God. It doesn't work that way. He says, if you commit adultery, if you don't commit adultery, but you go ahead and murder, do you think your non-adultery will cancel out your murder? No, you're a murderer, period. You're a sinner, period. To some, you may be thinking, Kenny, you're really spending a lot of time here. And you may think, well, James is making a big deal out of something that's not all that big of a deal. But this idea of discrimination, this idea of favoritism, it is a big deal. And this is why, because it indicates the tilt of our soul. It indicates the axis, the tilt that our soul is sitting on. Our planet is 93 million miles away from the sun. It sits on a 23.5-degree axis. And the north part of our Earth, what we refer to as the North Pole, is directly aligned with the North Star. Thus, we call it the North Star, right? And so here is the concept for us to think about. If that tilt were 5 degrees one way or 5 degrees the other way, or even many much smaller increments, we either freeze to death or we're incinerated by the sun. The axis of the Earth matters. Church, it matters. It's not how close we get to the sun in our orbit. It's the axis of the earth, and the axis of your soul matters, because the axis of your soul will determine whether or not you can allow for the flourishing of relationships and life in your soul, or if you're gonna freeze or incinerate the people around you. So your tilt matters. Church, where is your tilt? If you're a follower of Christ, what is the axis of your soul? How are you viewing people around you that might be different in some capacity? Orienting our hearts or our souls to Christ creates a condition around us for the formation of life, for the formation of spiritual life. We can easily fool others by using the right words, quoting some Bible verses. We deliver it with ease or apparent conviction, but it doesn't mean our faith is real. That's what James is saying. It's not just the words. Lip service doesn't work. He shows us that our faith is not demonstrated by a group of rules. So what demonstrates our faith? And the second thing I want you to write down is don't let your faith be a corpse. Don't let your faith be a corpse. And if you don't like that word, if you're offended by it, it's God's word. So you're going to find I didn't pick these words, all right? So James chapter 2, verse 14. I'm out of breath. I'm talking a lot today. Sorry. We're going to get going. We're going to beat those other people to lunch. That's all you need to know. All right? All right, he says, in James 2:14, he says, what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't show it by your action? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Man, what a piercing question. Will your faith save you? If there's no action, no activity, no drive, nothing that pushes forward, is that a kind of faith that saves? He says, suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing. He goes on in verse 16, and you say goodbye, have a good day, stay warm, and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? I'm a great Christian, except I've never sacrificed anything ever in my life to serve God. Right? It doesn't make sense. He says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Ooh, that's a piercing and difficult statement. The Message is a transliteration or a paraphrase. He says it this way. In that he says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Dead and useless. I mean, it is stunning when you start thinking about this. We love to say things that we can't support or just aren't true. Or my favorite, the anonymous email. Why do we send the anonymous email? Like you create the email address, anonymous1238. And why are there so many of them? Why have so many people created anonymous emails to send me an email? Just call me. It's inconsistent with the faith of a follower of Christ. It's all about relationships. So he continues. Now, someone may argue, some people have faith, others say, I have deeds. I have good deeds. So they're two different things. And what he says is, I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have any good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. It's really an important principle for us. Many believers were claiming to follow Jesus, but no one would ever know. And the question I have for us this morning who are followers of Christ is there a sense that anyone would ever know you're a follower of Christ outside of you walking in this building? Whatever this building is for you, whatever location you're on, is there a sense that anyone would ever know? Verse 19 says, you say you have faith for you believe that there is one God. He says, good for you. Even the demons believe, and they tremble in terror. He says, if you just have faith, if your idea is I'm going to have faith, I'm never going to live out my faith, he says, your faith without works puts you in the same class as demons. Now that is a stuttering statement. Your faith without works puts you in the same class as demons. I mean, there's things we say that don't add up. Well, I love my kids. I want them to know, or I love my kids. I want them to know God, but I'm not going to ever tell them about God, right? I'm trying to lose weight, but I spend 2 nights a week at the buffet, right? I'm trying to learn a language, but I bought Rosetta Stone, and I never actually listened to it, right? Or I want to pass the test, but I'm never going to study. I want to follow Jesus. I'm never going to obey, right? These things are oxymorons. We get that. But somehow when it comes to faith, James is having a hard time with a group of people he's writing to, and I think maybe applies to many of us today. But here's an important distinction. We don't work for our salvation. We work out our salvation. Works are not something, things we do are not things we do in order to get to heaven, right? What we do shows the faith that we do have. Because many of us have a lot of knowledge. Many of us have a lot of information. But it's often the application of the information that runs us astray. So I have a 3-year-old son. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we have a 6-month-old. Oh, they're great. And so my 3-year-old son, we were at a hotel a couple of weeks ago, and we were on vacation. And they had put us at the end of the hallway because they knew we had 3 kids and they didn't want to ruin everyone else's vacation. So we're at the end of this hallway in this giant complex hotel, and it's 50 yards, maybe 100 yards, I don't know. It's a long way to the elevator. And it's down this real straight hallway, and then kind of around the edge of the hallway, right around the corner, are the elevators. And so we go out one day, we're going to the beach or the pool or whatever we're doing, and my kids, they start taking off. They take off several times. They're running down there. They're pressing the button. I can only imagine someone's judging my parenting because they're pressing the button. The doors are opening. They don't get on because they're looking and like, where's the adults? You guys are just there. The door's closed. They carry on, right? I mean, I'm only imagining that happens. And so one time, they run down there. They press the button, and my 3-year-old jumps on the elevator. And then the elevator door closes. And all I hear in the hallway in this 14-story hotel is, Camden, get out of the elevator. What's wrong with you? Mommy and Dad, you're going to be mad. From my 5-year-old, right, who is clearly great at disciplining. As a big sister, it's part of her role. And so I'm like, I look at my wife, and we've got we walk a little faster, and sure enough, we get there. He gone. Like, elevator doors have closed. There's no like little symbol what floor they're on. Apparently we're in an archaic time. I don't know. But there's 4 elevators, and my wife can hear the wailing, right? It's like wailing, and this elevator's going up and down. You just hear him wailing, like, poor guy. And so I get on the elevator. I go to the bottom. She goes to the top. We kind of work our way through until eventually we find each other. He's not a very people-oriented person, so he didn't talk to anybody. And so we eventually find him. And so then every time thereafter he goes to get on an elevator, even any recent times we've been at an elevator, he won't get on. Like, he'll put one foot, and then he'll remember that incident, and he'll stop. And so sometimes I just push him a little. You know, I'm just kidding. I don't do that. But I've thought about it. Like, I've thought, remember, I have a spare. I have another son, so I have an heir and a spare. It was just a little push. Yeah, it's no big deal. I'm just kidding. I have thought. I haven't done that. I don't think I would do that. Also, if you know anybody who does counseling for 3-year-olds, I could probably use them in my family. But as I was thinking about that in the scope of what James is talking about, right? My son all week had gotten in the elevator, He'd pressed the button. He knew where we were going. He had all the information he needed. But in that moment, he didn't apply it. And so he got lost on an elevator. And many of us as followers of Christ are lost on the elevator of life. We know where to go. We know what God's told us to do, and we're not pressing the button. We're not pressing. We know God is saying, go here. And we're saying, no, I don't want to press that button. I don't know what's going to be on the other side of those doors. We've got all the information we need, and we lack the application. Buckminster Fuller was a guy who lived, 50 or 100 years ago. And he made the assertion that he observed information doubled every 100 years leading up to the year 1900. After World War I, he said he believed information was doubling every 25 years. As of 2011, the belief was that information was doubling every 13 months. And today, church, information is doubling every 12 hours in our world. We are drowning in information, but many of us refuse to apply it. If we'll just apply the things, everybody wants to know more about God, more about the Bible, more, I want to know more. What if we just lived out what we know? We could spend the rest of our life just living out what we already know. And James says as much in verse 20. He says, can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? Can't you see? It's so obvious to him. I grew up with that brother who literally lived out what he said. Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham, remember Abraham was the first Jew? It was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son on the altar. And so God had told Abraham, I want you to go on top of this mountain with your son, and we're going to provide an offering. And so Abraham goes up this mountain with his only son that he'd waited 90 years to be born. In an unimaginable step of faith, he puts his son on an altar, imagining that God wants him to give up that which is most important. And God wasn't interested in human sacrifice. He wasn't interested in killing a boy. He was interested in the faith of Abraham that would set their trajectory for millions of Jews throughout the centuries. And so God provided something different. He didn't kill his son. But James goes back and says, hey, faith was demonstrated by an action. We're not talking about Abraham's great faith because he talked about it. We're talking about Abraham's great faith because he lived it. So what does it look like to live it? How do we live that out? God's not calling you to sacrifice people. He's calling you maybe to be willing to sacrifice what's most important to you. Be willing to give up what's most important to you in order to have what he has for you, which will quickly become way better than what we currently have. Look here in verse 22. He says, you see his faith and his actions work together. His actions made his faith, what's that word? Complete. And so it happened, just as the scriptures say, Abraham believed God. God counted him as righteousness because of his faith, and he was called even a friend of God. Verse 24, he says, so you see, we are shown to be made right, to be right with God by what we do and not by faith alone. And so here's a really important distinction. I don't want anybody to leave with this confusion. Shown and made are not the same thing. All right? We don't work our way to heaven. As a follower of Christ, our responsibility is to live out our faith, but that faith is what makes us right with God. Jesus didn't come and down a cross so that you could earn the way to go to heaven. If there were another way other than the death of Jesus and the sacrifice that he made in order for those of us who are followers of Christ to move forward in faith, to enter into a relationship with God, there would have been. If we could have worked our way there, we would have done it that way. So you can't work your way to heaven. He says if you have faith, it takes action, and it shows what we believe. Verse 25, the last little section here, he says, Rahab the prostitute's another example. She was shown to be made right with God by her actions when she hid from those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. And here's the really, if you don't know the story, she was a Gentile. She was poor on the outcast of society in a city called Jericho, and the Israelites were entering into their promised land. And eventually Joshua, this is the same city, he would march around 7 times, they'd blow some trumpets, the wall would fall down, and they would conquer. Before all that gets to, there's a group of men that are messengers, and they go in and they go into the city to check it out. Well, they're found out that they're spies. So Rahab hides the spies in her house, on her roof, underneath some straw. And she lets them out. She lives in a roof that's adjacent to the wall. So she gets them out of the city. They're saved. And when they come back, Rahab is spared because of the faith that she has. Remember, she was a prostitute. She heard all sorts of stories from outside of the community and outside of the city. And so why is that in there? Why the contrast between Rahab and Abraham? Because James' principle applies to everyone, not just someone. This isn't just for the rich or the poor, it's for the rich and the poor. This isn't just for one ethnicity or the other, it's for both and. I'm a both and kind of guy. Whenever somebody presents me with an option, I'm like, I don't want either or, I want both. Now that doesn't work with like my wife. Like I want just my wife. Like I don't want another wife. I don't want you to hear that wrong. But like I'm really happy with one wife. And how Solomon pulled off the whole 700 thing, I don't know. Right, that seems like a disaster. One is good work. And so I'm a both and kind of guy, except for where Jesus says I should not be and is wise not to be. But that's the whole concept here. We don't have to be, her faith, we don't have to be away from faith because of the decisions that we don't make. We can make decisions that are consistent with our faith. We can make decisions that help live out our faith. And he says, look, these are two paralleling different people. Abraham and Rahab are drastically different. One founded an entire faith, and the other one was a prostitute. They're very different. So here's the last verse I want to read to you. In verse 26, it says, just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. Another translation and the message says it this way. The very moment you separate body and spirit, you end up with a corpse. Separate faith and works, you get the same thing, a corpse. It doesn't work. You can't connect the two. Faith without works doesn't work. So what do we do about it? How do we live this out? And I hear you saying, Kenny, if you follow Jesus, it will make you better at life and make your life better. But how do we get there today? How do we get there with this? And maybe you've got hopefully some principles and leading that God's given you, but I want to give you 3 thoughts that I hope shape how you choose to act this week. The first is this: disengaging from discrimination. Disengaging from discrimination. It means we let love win. It means we knock the jokes, the stupid talk off, the stuff that doesn't matter. That's not consistent with who Jesus is. All types of favoritism, all brands of people, all groups. We disengage from discrimination, disengage from favoritism. The second thing is we're going to champion unity. As followers of Christ, we're going to champion unity. We're going to be known for what we're for and not for what we're against. We're going to be for the Permian Basin instead of trashing it over and over again with our low self-esteem centered community, right? We're going to get to know somebody that maybe intimidates us. I had the opportunity to do this. I have a person in our neighborhood that has become our friends, and they are from another country, and they have they are another faith. They're of another faith, and so they're Hindu, and they had a kind of what we would call maybe in Christianity baby dedication, something like that, for their child a couple of months ago. And so my wife and I, we went and we hung out, and it was intimidating because I'm a spiritual leader, right? I should know what's going on in a spiritual environment, and I didn't. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wanted them to know that I loved them. I knew I wanted, not that I'm going to accept their faith necessarily, and I'm going to certainly tell them the truth, but I want to champion unity with my life. And then number 3, we're going to live out what we believe. As followers of Christ, we're going to live out what we believe. There's a lot of bad people in our world that are living out what they believe, and I think that's probably because there's a lot of good people in the world that are not living out what they believe. Let that soak in. So when I was a kid, there was this TV show. It was called Mystery Science Theater 3000. And the TV show was kind of a comedy, and I think it was probably on like Nick at Night. I think it really predated me, but I thought it was a good show. And so it was this silent movie, and there were these 3 guys that would like commentate on the silent movie. Like they would make it up as they go. And so I used to watch it for a while. Then my friends and we would just mute it and make it up as we go, because that was actually way more fun and interesting to us. And I thought about that in the scope of our faith. For many people, in fact, I would say for most people in our life, it is a silent movie. They have no idea what you're thinking. Many people have no idea if you're a follower of Christ and you're in the grocery store, they don't know what kind of a day you've had. All they know is the faith that you've lived out and what they see in a silent movie. So if your life was a silent movie, would anyone see faith and works? Would it be an either or? There was a professor that illustrated this best, and I'll close with this. He asked a group of graduate students in a classroom, he said, I want you to take your pencils. He said, I want you to take it and I want you to hold it 3 feet above the ground with your thumb and your index finger. So a group of graduate students awkwardly held their pencils or pens, whatever it is, 3 feet off the ground. He said, I want you to try and drop the pencil or pen, whatever it is you're holding, Of course, the sound of pencils or pens around the room hitting the ground could be heard, but it was obvious that the professor was not pleased. He said, I asked you to try and drop your pencils, not to actually drop them. With the pencil, either you drop it or you don't. Trying doesn't work. And either, if you're a follower of Christ, either you're living it out with works or you're not. There's not an energy of trying it. Trying doesn't do anything. So if you're a follower of Christ, live it out. You might fail. You might screw it up. I do literally every day. I got my kid lost in an elevator. Okay? But I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep putting energy and effort towards it. And if you're a follower of Christ, that's the responsibility you have. That's what James says, who grew up with Jesus. Do it this way. Put your faith and works together and see what God does with your life. Let me pray with you. God, thanks for today. Thanks for the opportunity we get to be here freely. And God, we thank you for every person on every location. And today I pray that you would give them the courage, those who are followers of Christ, to take an action step, to take a step forward in their faith, to apply a lesson, to apply a piece of information. Maybe it's something they heard today or something you've been speaking to them for a very long time. God, I pray that that application would provide transformation both in their life and the life of the people around them. And for those who may not yet be followers of Christ, I pray that you would give them the courage to realize this following Christ thing is not about raising a hand in a church. It's not about coming and talking and praying a prayer. It's about living out our faith. And if we're going to begin on that journey, if we're going to begin on following Christ, it's going to require sacrifice. And so if you're here and you want to follow Christ, I encourage you, come find one of our pastors. We'll be down front afterwards at every one of our locations. So God, thank you. Thanks for what you've done. Thanks for James and the story he wrote that we get to tell today. We love you and ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.